Welcome, everyone. Today is April 24th, 2019. Tonight we have a panel that is going to be talking about using coaching skills to expand your effectiveness as an educator by using in multiple different levels. And we have three panelists who have joined us who are all coaching experts as well as educators. We have with us Dr. Danielle Bain, Dr. Kathy Norwood, and Dr. Carl Swearingen. They're all scholar practitioners from Fielding. And I've prepared a series of questions for them. And then after they've answered the prepared questions, we'll open it up for dialogue from the group. So just to kick things off, if we could have each panelist tell us about your journey of incorporating coaching into your work as an educator. And let's start with Dr. Danielle.
Okay, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here with this panel. This is something I've been looking forward to, so thank you. So I think my journey with using coaching in education, I think it can mostly be summed up as with the word informal. My teaching style has always been pretty approachable, and I tried to make it that way even when I was doing 100% online teaching. And so I think I began with doing what probably most people would think of in a generalized way as sort of coaching, not so much what we think of it after we start the evidence-based program necessarily. When I thought about, working with students, because I think I know for sure there were a lot of students who came to see me and I think felt more comfortable because of my approachable teaching style. And at that point I was doing what I think educators call discovery learning, trying to use discovery learning questions with them. And I think that's where the biggest parallel with what we call professional coaching or evidence-based coaching is. As I gained more experience and spent a little bit more time in the world, I found that faculty members, especially newer faculty members, would also come. And I spent all my time in higher education, by the way. Newer faculty members would also come and chat with me about things. And so my role really was informal until I was asked to teach a class in the master's program at West Virginia University. It was a corporate and professional, very applied master's degree. And I started researching coaching because I was in a communication field and how you use communication and coaching. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I should be doing. This is the part of my job I love the most. And that's really how I got launched into coaching, with a few conversations about that as a possibility, and that's how I discovered Fielding. So I think until that point, it was sort of the very broad connotation of coaching, even though I was doing a lot of discovery learning questions, which I think are very much parallel with coaching, the way we think of it at Fielding.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Dr. Carla, let's hear about your journey.
Well, it's not a linear journey, which that kind of bothers me. But I, like Danielle, I've also spent my whole time in higher ed. That is my world. I spent 10 years as a full-time teaching faculty member in chemistry. So I've certainly done my time in general chemistry labs. I never really had any plans to do anything beyond teaching and researching. But now I'm a full-time administrator. So I'm a Dean of Faculty Development, that's just a funny story in and of itself. I mean, no kid ever decides that they want to be a college administrator when they grow up. But
True story. Very true. Very true.
What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a college administrator. I kind of got sucked into administration. Maybe that's not the best word, but that's kind of how it feels. Because I recognized a gap in our new faculty onboarding process, namely that we didn't have any mentoring at all. And I really needed that as a new faculty member. So I went out and found my own mentor, who is a history professor. And I don't think I would have survived my first year without her. She was so wonderful. So a few years after I started, I recommended to the person who was the faculty development director at that time, I said, we really need to add a new faculty mentoring component to our onboarding of new faculty members. And if any of you have ever worked at a small institution or a small company, you probably know the answer, which was, yes, that is wonderful. You should do that. Congratulations, you are the new coordinator of new faculty mentoring. And that's how I got sucked into administration. So a few years ago, I transitioned into full-time administration, doing faculty development. And I realized that I needed some training as I was working with faculty members, specifically faculty members who are really struggling or underperforming in the classroom. And they would come talk to me about what their issues were. And a lot of times it wasn't really about teaching, it was about just life stuff. Or, you know, if their teaching was disorganized, it was because the rest of their life was too. And I didn't really know how to help them. And so I found the discipline of coaching, which has been a great fit. And that's what led me to fielding as well.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Yeah. Quite the journey, right? From chemistry professor to faculty development, right? That's great.
Right.
Thank you. So Dr. Norwood, let's hear about your story. Oh, you're on mute, Kathy.
And I just said my wisest comments, right? No, thank you very much. And I welcome everybody. It was wonderful to hear both of your stories, Carla and Danielle. I've been a national consultant since 1996, working in the schools with literacy, English language learners, leadership development, and coaching around the areas of school reform and school initiatives. And previously I had done all types of teaching. And so I felt ready for that. So I was going to go out there and conquer the world and do all of this wonderful work throughout the nation. And so I spent years working long-term contracts in different parts of the nation. And we would get to a point in time where a program would change, or a new personality would come in, or something would shift in the system, and all of the good work we did went to the wayside. And I knew I was called to do that type of work, and I became so disillusioned, and I went through a real deep depression, and I thought, you know, I can either get out and move into something new for myself, or go back and learn more about what we're missing in education, because I had my finger on the pulse of education throughout the nation. I saw what was happening in the different states. I knew we were missing something. So that's what took me back to fielding for my my educational leadership and change coursework. And as I was there, I decided I was going to do my research in transformational coaching and education, because I always had an inkling that that was the key. But what I was doing as coaching wasn't real coaching, and I didn't know that at that point. Well, that was when the EBC program started, and so I was the first educator that was welcomed into the evidence-based coaching program. And so during that period of time, I was able to apply that learning to my dissertation work. And since then, my dream and my vision is all about bridging educational coaching with professional coaching. So what I've been doing since that time is working with districts to create models that will sustain themselves, work with leadership and leadership development, their teachers, help them set up frameworks, and we teach their coaches how to coach. So we're seeing just phenomenal changes because of that additional piece, that if we want to bring out about sustainability in any organization, any work that we do, the people that we're working with have to have complete ownership of that work at some point in time. So they certainly need lots of consulting and mentoring, but there's a point in time where they got to get out and do it on their own. And that's where that coaching piece, if it becomes embedded and a part of what we do all of the time, we can begin to see shifts and changes. So now I'm continuing the work as a professional coach.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And I'm curious, you mentioned earlier in your introduction that what you were doing wasn't real coaching. So I'm curious, how is professional coaching different from what is commonly practiced in education? And Kathy, I'm going to have you start this with this part.
All right. Well, part of the research, the Gates Foundation did a wonderful study a few years back, and when they really studied educational coaching in the schools, The word that they used was basically it's atheoretical, that we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, but because a principal or an administrator sees that we're really good in the classroom, they put us into a role called coaching to work with adult learners. And so they're not being trained properly. They don't have the evidence-based approaches behind them. They don't have the tool belt to pull from in working with our teachers and our leaders and our children. So when they have instructional coaching and they have different forms of coaching, but when you really look at how it's defined, it's more consulting and mentoring. And they do really, really well with that piece. We don't want to throw that piece away. That's so needed. But they haven't known how to add this piece into their work to bring forth the sustainability piece.
Interesting. So Dr. Danielle, any thoughts about how you see coaching, what was typically done in education different from professional coaching?
Well, I agree with what Carla and Kathy said. I think what educators in higher education anyway see as coaching is not really coaching. If you were to ask them, I don't even know if the word coaching would come to their minds. I think they would call it something else. But maybe if you ask them, they would say, yeah, it is kind of coaching. I think what they're doing a lot of is advising and playing the role of expert. Occasionally some counseling, in the form of good listening because students show up with a crisis. And that's what caused them to not turn their papers in. And so that's why they're in the office in a crisis, because my mom got sick or my dog died or, the dog ate the homework. But I think what they're doing is they're doing some listening, and then they're doing a lot of advising and providing quick is a big piece of it because of the pressure that's on higher education faculty members right now. They're providing quick tidbits of how do you do this? And then sometimes they're actually sending them places where they might get forms of coaching, like the career counseling centers, or they send them to the student, whatever that version of student psychotherapy is. And they might get some coaching there, but I think almost exclusively they're doing advising and not exploring the real needs of what the student, what those students are. What are those real needs, and why? What really drove them to show up in your office in such a panic?
Makes sense. Anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Carla?
Yeah, at least in my world, at my university, nobody even knows what coaching is. And if they've heard of it, they just associate it with the business world and think it doesn't have any place in education. So I feel like I spend a large part of my time actually explaining what coaching is and how it differs from mentoring or advising or consulting. And mentoring has become pretty accepted in the higher ed world, but even that tends to be reserved for specific groups of people. So new faculty or struggling faculty or minorities or women. And so I do spend a lot of my time with administrators talking about the value of coaching and who needs it and why.
Thank you. I'm also curious what you see as the biggest challenges in education today and how you think coaching can help. Who would like to start?
I could start on that if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I spent some time thinking about this because I thought, wow, there's a long list, but what are the biggest ones? And I sort of narrowed down to 3. And I think one of them is the productivity push that's on research faculty in higher ed. It's extraordinary, and they're trying to figure out a way to quantify it so that they can have some form of accountability, which I think is the second, one of the other major challenges. We're trying to quantify productivity so they have some version of accountability. It seems to me that higher education is trying to straddle corporation and the old version of how colleges and universities work, and they haven't quite figured out how to marry the two. I'm not even sure that higher education should be married to that, although I am all for some version of accountability. I don't want to misstate that. And then I think for me, the third thing is among students, the capacity for critical thinking has changed significantly. And I don't know what's driving that. I have a few hypotheses, but I think that there are pockets of it that are fantastic. And then I'm not really sure where the rest of it went. I'd like to see a lot more of it among the students. And if that continues, it'll certainly flow into faculty as well and administration.
Thank you. Dr. Carla, thoughts about how coaching, what are some of the biggest challenges and how coaching can help?
Yeah, this was a great question. And I thought of kind of two different answers. One is just the pace of change. I think right now in the world of higher ed, I think it's really unprecedented. I think up until the last decade, we've really enjoyed a long history of stability, and which is good for higher ed because we're not built for rapid turnaround.
Right.
Things happen very slowly in the world of higher ed. And part of that is culture, but part of it is just the way the system is built too.
Yeah.
So anything to change takes at least 1 to 2 years, right? And that's so different from the business world. And it's hard to keep up with the change that's occurring in culture when you have a system that's not really built for change. So I think that's one really big challenge that coaching can help with, because it helps people to manage that change more effectively. And the second one, which is somewhat related to that pace of change, is the fear of the unknown future, because we really don't know what education is going to look like in the next 5 or 10 years. There's a Harvard business professor who recently predicted that half of all colleges and universities will either close or go bankrupt in the next decade.
Yeah, I read that too.
Yeah, I hope he's wrong. I mean, we don't know what the future holds, and that's pretty disconcerting, because a lot of academics actually go into higher ed because it's been relatively free from market burdens in the past, but that's no longer the case. It's one of the reasons I went into higher ed. I mean, except for my love of students, which I do love students, but I could be making 2 or 3 times the salary if I went and worked in industry, but I don't want to deal with all of the change and getting laid off and things like that you don't typically have in higher ed. But I think that's changing, and we just don't know what the future holds. And so that's difficult, especially for academics. So I think that's one area that coaching can really help individuals do, is react to change in a positive manner, and also help leaders understand the challenges and fears that faculty are facing about that unknown future.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Terry, could I go back and sort of close the loop on my response? I just thought of something. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I actually didn't finish my response, and I don't know why I left it out, but thinking about how coaching can help, I think Carla's program that she came up with the idea for, and of course then got to lead, in terms of, how you help new faculty, I think that plays a big role in helping productivity. But I also think those faculty who are mid-career could really benefit from coaching and figuring out what's next. What are the next big steps, so that I don't slide backwards, but wow, I don't have to go at quite the same pace. And instead, maybe I need to focus on grants, because now I already got the tenure, if we keep up with the same system. And then with the critical thinking, I think that's where teachers coaching makes a huge difference. Asking those critical thinking prompts makes a huge difference, where you're really kind of shifting, or maybe not shifting, but overlapping coaching with teaching in that moment. And I think that's a big difference. It's something you don't get to do in every coaching situation. I'll put it that way. That's one of the things that's unique to teaching.
Great. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me finish.
Dr. Norwood.
Yes, Terry, thank you. I just love this question. So, when we look at K-12 and birth to 5, most leaders and teachers, teaching has become so complex. And when we think about Keegan's work around in over our heads, most of those leading in education today are really in over their heads. It's so complex. What worked yesterday is not working today. What's working today won't work tomorrow. So we don't learn how to, in a respectful, dignifying way, work with our adult learners to access the genius and the deep wisdom within everybody who's in the system. We're not going to make it. And so Julio Olala, who's the author of Ontological Coaching, I had the wonderful opportunity to interview him in my research. And he said, Kathy, aim to the soul of the person. He said, we've lost the soul in education. We have to come back and address the whole person and the whole system, and address humanity and help people find their sense of well-being. So yes, we look at performance levels, we look at student success, we look at quality of work, but we also look at the human being and how can we access those answers within them to be able to bring about the shifts and changes needed in any system. So my vision is to see it totally embedded in the system as a whole. It becomes the core of how we do business. And in a lot of districts I've been working in, the leaders open their meetings with coaching each other first before they move into their meetings. The leaders are coaching their teachers. The teachers are coaching their students. They're beginning to teach the children and the students how to coach each other. And in Birth to 5, they're starting to coach the families in the home settings. So if it can be an embedded approach of honoring the adults that we work with, infused within the system as a whole, everybody can learn how to coach. It would be a much better world.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you all for explaining, some of the big challenges out there. And now I'd love to hear your perspective on what you see as the primary role of coaching in educational systems. So who would like to kick us off?
I can do that.
Great, thank you.
If you look at some of the research on what motivates faculty, the number one reason why individuals choose to work in higher education is because of autonomy, right? So faculty have their very narrow field of expertise and it's their field, right? They've written the dissertation on it. They know it better than anyone else. They get to teach what they want. They get to research what they want. And, for the most part, they're largely left alone. And there's some great things about being autonomous in higher ed. However, the con of that is that the academic life can also be really isolating. And a lot of faculty experience that. And, teaching 18 to 22-year-olds is not always easy. They can be difficult. So that's one way that I've seen coaching really be helpful with faculty members, is helping to counteract some of that autonomy. It's a space where they can build community. They don't feel as isolated. They don't have to be the expert about everything. I don't have to be the expert about everything, which is another great thing about coaching. And that's true for leadership as well. I mean, administrators feel lonely and isolated and don't have people that they can really trust and talk to. So some of the major issues that I've seen as I've coached some faculty and administrators at my institution have been relationship issues. This is true. This is not just true in higher ed. This is true in every sector, right? There are relationship issues with colleagues and bosses. As I mentioned before, that coping with rapid change and uncertainty of the future, some fear associated with that. Another thing that I end up talking about with a lot of faculty, which you wouldn't necessarily associate this with people who have doctorates, but they can really suffer from the imposter syndrome or the inner critic that's trying to sabotage their work. So we talk about that quite a bit. And then as Danielle mentioned earlier too, especially for mid-career faculty, how do you envision a lifelong career in higher ed? And how do you keep it fresh semester after semester? So those are some of the roles that I see coaching playing in my work.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Carla. Who'd like to go next? Okay, Dr. Danielle.
I was trying to hand it off to Kathy there, but I will go because I'm off mute. Well, I echo everything Carla said. I think that all of those things, loneliness is, and I think the more that we do online learning, the more that loneliness and isolation plays a huge role. And so to that point, I think one of the things that frequently happens is that great researchers become department chairs. And department chairs who are great researchers sometimes have those terrific leadership skills, and sometimes they're leaders because they're fantastic researchers. So I think that's an opportunity for growing leaders. I mean, certainly there are leaders in lots of other areas of a university, but you know, in those departments, they typically get chosen because it's their turn, or because they are great researchers and they've earned enough hits on their CV that they can take a break from researching and leave the department. And so I think one of the biggest opportunities is to help those folks develop themselves and think differently about how they go to work and what they do at work every day. I think the other piece is, for me, where coaching can make a big difference with students, is the pressure for students to arrive at college with a chosen career path has become extraordinary. If you look at high schools in the top 5 in each state, many of them are asking students to choose career paths or paths in general, just even though it's very broad, to choose their high school classes. And so then they are supposed to have like sort of made this decision at a time when their brains may have a full decade of development or major development left. And so my experience is the majority of the undergraduate stress that I have spent time listening to is major changes, and the pressure that they feel to please their parents, to please themselves, especially in the culture of perfection among women, which is happening in teenage girls in a big push right now. And those young ladies are about to start college or have just recently started college. And I think there's a lot of coaching opportunities there to help them find themselves and feel confident in their career path choice.
Great, thank you. Dr. Norwood.
I just echo what they're sharing. It's so needed. What I would add, I kind of touched on it earlier in my sharing, but what I would add here is that one of the mindsets that's still prevalent is that coaching is a fix-it model in education. It's not an accelerated model of learning. So number one, we want to reframe it and say, you know, because you're a genius, I'm going to provide you a coach and help you, you know, in whatever way you need to do your best work and to really find that deep satisfaction in your life. The other piece that is so prevalent with our administrators is, again, they're so lonely, and it is that imposter syndrome. When I work with a group together, they have a need to perform for each other. They're afraid to let down those walls. So we need executive coaching from the outside going into a system to provide that safe space for them. And then the third piece that I see is being able to reframe coaching as a process for an embedded professional learning that's continuous for all people in the educational system. So it again just becomes a part of, if we have this initiative or reform movement that we need to have implemented, at some point everybody who's in charge of that will get a level of coaching to ensure it becomes implemented and sustain itself. That's always been the missing piece. So it's just how we learn together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'd love to hear next some of the impact that you've seen and that coaching can have on students. So if you have worked with students, what has been the impact that in using coaching with them? So Kathy, I know you've done a lot of work with students, so I'm going to ask you to kick us off there.
I want to be able to make sure everybody else gets a chance to share. You know, it's impacted students and teachers everywhere as far as their scores and their sense of well-being. I could really share a lot in that vein, but I want to share actually a quick story that came from the person that I was coaching today, who has been coaching in a district. And she was so excited about the change she had seen in her music teacher. She had been working with this teacher who works with all students in the district K-12 and was really struggling. And because of this ongoing coaching, this teacher now is doing research on the brain and is bringing in music and sounds and tones and rhythms in a way that it imprints the learning on the brain of the child. And so she's presenting at conferences. She had a TV special in Oregon. And she's putting together professional development. She's written grants that are getting, like her recent grant, she's got a 5-gallon barrel and 2 drumsticks that she's placing in all of the classrooms. And then she's teaching them, so if they're teaching character traits or beginning, middle, end, they're learning what tones or what volume or what portion to drum at that point in time when they're teaching that specifically. And what's happening with the children, number one, their learning is accelerating. They're remembering their learning, they're loving their learning, and the behavior aspects within the classroom have really settled down, and they've become a community. Now, this is within one district, and yet it's already starting to go out throughout the nation based on the work of one coach with one teacher who was so zealous and ready to learn. So to me, that's so powerful.
Great. Great story. Okay. Dr. Carla, anything you'd like to add regarding what you've seen happen when students get coaching?
Well, I don't have a lot to say about this because I don't coach students. I only coach faculty. But I mentioned I taught for 10 years, and actually I still teach a class every other semester. I really love students. So actually the way that I view my job holistically, and what's really motivating to me, is to think about the impact of my work with a single professor in terms of how many students that they can impact. So if I can help a faculty member to become more productive and more fulfilled and more excited about their work, then they get to impact hundreds of students every semester. So that's pretty exciting. And I did, just about a week ago, I got an email from our Dean of Student Support Services, and she had read an article about training advisors to use coaching principles when they're advising students. Because, you know, in advising, you're often very focused on, okay, what are the classes you need to graduate, right? We want to graduate you in 4 years. But advising can be so much more. It's thinking and dreaming about the future and making plans and setting goals. And so if we could train faculty to use kind of coaching principles in those advising sessions and move away from just the transactional, what do I need to do to graduate, to that thinking about the future, that's really exciting. So I said, yes, I will do that.
Excellent. Absolutely. Thank you.
That does sound exciting. I'm just thinking about the advisors I know and what they would do with that, how they would operationalize that. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, it's a great article if you want me to send it to you.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Please do. I would love that.
Post it on the community of practice as well. That would be really great. Thank you. Danielle.
I think that, well, I've already shared some about the impact on students. I continue to think that culture of perfection and the similar work that's being done with teenage boys that's going to play a bigger role in how we help them shed that weight of that desire for perfection. That's going to continue to play a role as those folks get into colleges. But I think my favorite story is when I did an experimental curriculum one time in my graduate class, and it was a master's program, and it was all traditionally age master's students, 22, 23-year-olds. And I designed it so that they had to design their own curriculum. So I gave them the criteria, and I said, you have to design your own. And they said, I don't understand. What do we do? And I said, it was a training and development class. And I said, well, you know, when you leave here, no one else is going to structure your learning for you. Mm-hmm. And each of you value learning, or else you wouldn't be in a graduate program. And so what you're doing through the process of this training and development content is learning to structure your own learning. And I only had 12, maybe 13 students in that class. And from 3 of them independently, I got feedback months later after they were already out in the world. Oh my gosh, Dr. Bain, thank you so much, because now I have figured out that I have to go read about this because that's what's on the mind of my boss, or I have to go learn about this because it's going to help me do my job better. And sometimes even for their own sort of community service, interest work, they had to go learn more things. And it had never occurred to them before that they had to figure out how to do that for themselves, because teachers had always been structuring it for them. And that's really one of my favorite stories about using coaching. And I sort of combined how I designed the curriculum with opportunities, because it took a lot of individual conversations for them to design that curriculum. But it was manageable because there were only 13 of them. And a lot of those conversations involved what we would, call professional or evidence-based coaching.
Great, thank you. Beautiful story. Well, so we have a couple of questions from the audience tonight, and Desiree, would you like to go off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay?
We hear you
Yeah.
just fine.
Okay. So my question for the group is, what do you all, for someone who's new to this, what would be the main difference between being a coach, a mentor, and just being a consultant? Because on the surface, they seem to be the same thing, but from conversations here and from others, I'm learning that they're quite different. So I'm still just trying to grasp like the main difference, if it couldn't be broken down to a main difference or a few main differences between them.
I'll take that, if I'll at least get us started, if you guys are good with that, comfortable with that.
Sure.
A quick way to answer that is with the language I, we, and you. If you think about a continuum of learning for our adult learners. So when I'm in the I mode, I'm establishing credibility, I'm sharing my expertise, I'm providing advice, I'm recommending, I'm teaching, I'm providing professional development. When I'm in the mentoring role, I've had more experience than the person that I'm working with, but it's much more about we, and we're working on it together and collaboratively. And so I might offer some teaching ideas or strategies, and then we do some things together, or I might share something and then my mentee shares something. And you're walking alongside and you're meeting them at their learning edge, and you're providing whatever's needed in that scaffold. When we move into the coaching role, it's now all about you. You're not hearing the language I and we. It's you, and I'm creating this space and I'm helping to mediate your thinking. You have the answers. You know what's next for your life. And I'm, with my coaching techniques, I'm creating a space for those answers to emerge within you. And you discover your own learning and you move it forward. So I'm not giving you any of my stuff at all. I'm just creating a space to mediate thinking for you.
Yeah. Kathy, something came up as you were talking about the you. Earlier we mentioned critical thinking skills have been diminishing. I think it was Dr. Bain was noticing that. Coaching really facilitates that process of developing critical thinking, because it really is up to the client, in this case the student or the faculty member or the administrator, to really come forward with their own ideas, as opposed to being in the receiving mode of an expert. And Fielding's model, I always tell new students at Fielding's that Fielding professors, we don't even really call ourselves professors typically. We're really more facilitators of learning, and we don't lecture. And coaching is a really core piece of what we're trying to do here, that was a learner-centric model. But I'd love to hear Danielle and Carla's viewpoint. Now that you've been studying evidence-based coaching for a while, what have you noticed are the core differences between coaching, mentoring, and consulting?
Oh, I just have to say, I have not had the privilege of hearing Kathy put that so succinctly before, and I have to own it. I'll give you credit, but I'm right there. I have to own that and use that. It's just fabulous because it's so succinct, and I agree with it completely. I think the I is about the teaching and the consulting, and it's very much about, I'm going to give you advice and I'm going to give you my expertise and I'm going to share content. And mentoring only does that in a little bit of the ways, because as Kathy said, you're mostly walking hand in hand with them. And I also always think of the word wise when I think mentor, and I think that's actually the root of the word is some version of the word wise when you look at the Greek or Latin root of the word. I think that's really probably all I can add to that, because I think Kathy just did such a great job of putting it all together.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote that down.
I think we all took notes on that one.
Uh,
It's very easy to understand.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
I do find sometimes that when people come to me for coaching, what they're really wanting is advice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to explain that that's not what coaching is. And there are a lot of reasons why I shouldn't give you advice. But also, I think there's a recognition that sometimes people do need mentoring or advising or consulting, and it's okay to give people what they need. You just have to be upfront with yourself and with them about what you're doing and why.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.
We have another question from the audience. Lisa, would you like to come forward and ask your question?
Sure, yes. Thank you all. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So based on the thoughts that you mentioned, oftentimes from what I've seen in higher ed and K through 12 are, especially in K through 12, educators often aren't seen as professionals, or the professional role is seen as separate from the educator role, and so that's sometimes where the difference in receiving coaching comes in. And so in responding to needs, like for example with enrollment in higher ed and K through 12 and changing demographics of students, how do you think coaching or consulting or mentoring can help faculty, staff, and maybe even students best evaluate their needs? So for example, if staff are being evaluated and they're working with groups of faculty and students, how can they best address those needs, and how can they best be evaluated and addressed as both educators and professionals?
Who would like to start?
Could I ask for some clarification?
Yeah, so
So are you saying how could coaching help either faculty or students evaluate their needs for continuing development?
yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. Ladies, would you like to address that, or shall I keep going?
If you want to start, that's fine.
I'll give it a shot. I think actually coaching is one of the best ways to help evaluate needs, because unless it's a really glaring absence of skill or capacity, willingness or ability, unless it's a really glaring absence of that, then it's going to be so much easier for the person in the client role to make any changes in their behavior or in their repertoire of understanding if they own that. And so coaching and the approach of coaching allows them to own it, because they would discover what that gap between where they want to be and where they are is. They would discover that for themselves. And I think that's the biggest plus for coaching, but I'll let my esteemed colleagues here build on that.
So one of the projects that I'm working on this summer is I'm writing a proposal to include coaching into our evaluation and promotion process. So as faculty move from assistant to associate to full professor, it's just a very long and labor-intensive process to go through that. And there are, so many documents that you have to prepare in order to go through that process. And we do that every 3 years at my institution. And one of those pieces of information that you produce as you work through that process is a professional development plan. But faculty know that it doesn't really make any difference in your packet, or your application packet, and it's really just pass or fail. So if you pass, you just sort of toss the professional development plan aside, and no one ever has a conversation about it. So that's really a missed opportunity to have a conversation about, what do I want from my career, and what like Danielle was saying, what skills do I want to incorporate? Where is there a gap between where I am and where I want to be? So that's one area that I'm going to try to insert coaching into our normal process. And we do something similar with our administrative evaluation. So administrators go through an evaluation every 3 years, and that includes a 360 assessment. And again, we sort of do it, the person looks at it, and then it gets filed away, and there's never a conversation around it. And I mean, that's so much wonderful data that we're collecting, and we're not doing anything with it. So that's kind of my area right now, where I see coaching really working well in the process that we already have at my institution. is just using that data that we're already collecting, building a coaching conversation or conversations around that to really help faculty grow and flourish, which is what we want.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and I forgot to mention this up front, one of the really powerful coaching models that is research-based is cognitive coaching in education with Robert Garmston and Art Costa. And their work came out of, I mean, some of their work when they looked at supervision and really looked at the research behind that, and if their teachers were growing, this is where it was birthed for them. They realized there wasn't the growth that was desired, and so they brought in that whole coaching piece to education. And what leaders are learning how to do today, whether it's with teachers or with students, once again, is there might be a part where there needs to be some level of evaluation, but then on that, at the end of that, you move into that coaching role where you help them discover their strengths, their talents, their direction, where they want to go, their desires, their hopes. Again, it's all about them. You're providing that initial scaffold up front. And so a lot of our administrators and leaders are operating on that level now, rather than just a clear, cold approach to supervision in attempting to grow teachers. So that connects with students coming in, certainly, because it's the same idea. We're giving them space to really explore their passion.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience that you'd like to ask? And if you do, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, I do have one final question for the panel, and that's, what advice do you have for other educators who want to incorporate coaching into their work? So why don't we hear from, go ahead.
Okay. The more you learn, the more you realize you need to learn. And so if we want to incorporate coaching in, we want to put ourselves into places where we can read and grow with other coaches. The other piece that's very, very important is to be coached. We can't give a gift to somebody that we haven't experienced ourselves. And so ongoing coaching for self, and then lots of study and practice with coaching wherever possible. It then becomes very evident in how you can apply it in the work that you do.
Great, great advice. If you're gonna coach, be coached. That's a great start.
Yes.
Dr. Danielle, any final words for our audience?
I think what Kathy said is fabulous. I think also, I mean, find the right niche. I think use good change management if you're going to try to roll coaching into your organization. You know, make some space for it, get some buy-in, do some pilot testing with people who have incredible informal influence, those opinion leaders, to use old school language, and get them talking about it. But I think the key piece, no matter how you introduce it or how much buy-in you get from people who want to use it, aside from being coached yourself, is to remember that if you're really coaching, it's a very active role for the client, whoever's in that client role. And so you got to make sure that person is up for it, because otherwise it's just a lot of wheel spinning for both people, for the person in the coaching role and the client role. So make sure that person is committed to doing some growth, whether it's making changes or just learning some new things and not making any behavioral changes, whatever their goal is. Make sure they're up for that, keeping that commitment.
Right. I think this is a really key point of explaining what coaching is and how it works and what the expectations are from the client side, because it's a very different modality than I think a lot of students are used to.
Yeah.
We're giving them a more center stage in many ways, being client-centered approach, or in this case, a learner-centric approach. Dr. Carla, any final words of wisdom for our audience tonight?
Words of wisdom, but I have some words.
Great, excellent.
Well, I would just point out, I mean, I don't know who's on the call and where you are in the journey of coaching, but there's a difference between being a fully trained coach and just using coaching principles. And anybody can use coaching principles and conversations in their work with administrators, teachers, and students. And so there's just some of those core tenets that are so important that anybody can learn. That belief that everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. The value of asking direct questions and actively listening, being a partner with someone in the work together, setting goals and designing action steps. I mean, those are things that you can do even if you're not a fully trained coach. And those can not only enhance relationships, but also help people to flourish.
Very well said. Excellent. And certainly everyone can bring coaching principles to certainly their role as an educator or whatever role that you're in, which leads us to kind of our closing statements tonight. This series that we're experiencing tonight is part of a larger evidence-based coaching professional series where we're bringing in experts from lots of different fields who have incorporated coaching to be less of an expert model and more of a facilitator model. And so I appreciate all of you coming tonight to really share how you have used coaching to further the field of education. And I just want to appreciate each of you for what you bring and the work you're doing in the world. I also just want to let our audience know that next month we'll be having a panel on diversity and inclusion. So we'll be bringing in experts in diversity and inclusion that have really used coaching in that space. We'll have our new Chief Diversity Officer of Fielding will be joining us, Tomas Neal, and then we'll also be having two other leaders in the field. The president of Inclusion Inc., Shirley Engelmeyer, she has developed a powerful tool which it measures inclusive leaders in leadership behaviors in the corporate and all other spaces. And I've had the pleasure of working with her organization for the last 5 years as an executive coach. So she'll be talking about how she uses coaching in creating inclusive leaders. And then our very own Christopher Hicks, who's a graduate of the EBC program and also a prominent diversity inclusion consultant, will be with us also. So definitely sign in and participate next month in that. We also will have a Thought Leaders webinar where Dr. Carol Ann Minsky will be talking about her successful outcomes for leadership self-efficacy. She'll be sharing her research that she did with executive coaching sessions and how you can ensure successful goal-setting outcomes. She'll be speaking on May 15th, so please join us there. And if you haven't yet joined our community of practice, anyone who is committed to coaching and interested in developing as a coach can join the coaching community of practice at Fielding. You just go to ccop.fielding.edu and you can sign up and hear about all of our upcoming events throughout the year. So thank you all for attending tonight, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. And thanks to our esteemed panelists tonight, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye for
Thank
now.
you, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.